Next, we're going to be installing VirtualBox, which will be our hypervisor. This will allow us to build and install virtual machines that we will use for the entirety of the Elastic Stack, as well as victim machines throughout all the rest of the labs throughout the book. So this is really important that you get this right. There are several ways to go about this. You can simply browse the VirtualBox website and download VirtualBox based on your operating system. If you're on Windows, Mac, Linux, it doesn't matter, it's right here. If you would like to use a package management system, there are several available that you can use. First, if you're on Mac OS, you can use Homebrew. Brew install cask VirtualBox. If you're on a Debian-based system, you can use apt-get. If you're on an RPM-based distribution, you can use DNF or Yum. First, we need to add the VirtualBox repo. And then simply install it using Yum or DNF. I'm simply canceling these because I don't need to do this. I already have VirtualBox installed. Finally, if you're using Windows, you can use Chocolatey. Again, these are various ways that you can install VirtualBox. The most simple way is to download it from the website. However, if you want to do it from the command line through package management that you use for your operating system, feel free to do that. Once you've installed VirtualBox, let's go ahead and fire it up. First, we're going to build a new virtual machine that we are going to use to install the Elastic Stack on. However, first we need to download the operating system. We're going to use CentOS. So you can go to the CentOS project in order to download the ISO for CentOS 8. You can simply grab whatever mirror is closest to you. It doesn't matter specifically which one you get. Usually these are organized from top to bottom in ways that are going to be most efficient. Once you've downloaded that, or while that's downloading in the background, you can create the virtual machine as a shell that we will add the ISO to once it's completed. So first, let's create a new virtual machine. Let's simply name it Elastic. This is going to be a Linux system, and it's going to be based on an RPM distribution. So we're going to use Red Hat 64-bit. As far as RAM goes, I really recommend a minimum of 8 gigabytes of RAM. If you can't quite give it that much because of your machine, then that's okay, but you definitely will notice some performance impacts and some services could have trouble starting and staying running. At a minimum, I recommend 8 gigs of RAM. For megabytes, that's 8,192 megabytes, which is 8 gigabytes. Next, we're going to create the virtual hard disk. We're going to accept the defaults here, except when we get to the size, and we're going to change it from 8 gigabytes to 40. Now we've created the virtual machine. We don't have an operating system or anything set up for it yet, but we're going to get there. Next, let's move on to the settings. Clicking on the virtual machine that you've created, click on the settings button, and let's start with system. First, we want to change the boot order. We want the hard disk to be first, optical to be second, and we don't want floppy to be involved at all. So you can just uncheck floppy, click on hard disk, and then click the up arrow so that it moves up in priority, and then optical, and finally network. Next, let's go over to storage, and let's add the ISO that we downloaded. Simply click under Controller IDE, there's a CD icon, click on it, and then you can click on the CD icon to the right here, and it'll ask which one you want to install. I'm going to install the CentOS 8 boot ISO that I already have. Next, let's move on to the network adapter. The first network adapter is going to use the internal network. We have to set this up in a pretty complex way because we need the virtual machines to be able to talk to each other so that the victim machine can send its data into Elasticsearch and that you from a browser on your host machine can access Kibana that is running on Elasticsearch. So there's a couple of hoops that we have to jump through in order to get the network adapters right. So first off, set this to internal network, and then internet will be by default. Moving over to adapter 2, we're going to set this, we're going to enable this, and then we're going to set it to NAT. We're going to click on the advanced button, and we're going to go to port forwarding. We're going to add 4 ports. One, they are going to be SSH so that we can remotely connect via SSH to the virtual machine. We're going to set TCP for Elasticsearch up so that we can send data to it. We're going to set Kibana up as a port forward so that we can access Kibana. And then also finally, we're going to set a 4th one called Fleet, which is how we perform command and control for all of the Elastic agents that are running on the system. So to do that, we simply click the plus sign, name this SSH. The protocol is going to be TCP. The host IP, which is our IP address that we're going to be funneling through, is going to be our local IP address, which is 127.0.0.1. The port is going to be, we're going to use port 2222, and I'll show you how to use this later. And then the guest IP will always be 10.0.3.15. And then we're going to send that to port 22. So when we SSH, we're going to be SSHing to ourselves over port 2222, which is then going to forward it to the guest IP address over port 22, which is the default for SSH. Moving on, we're going to add Elasticsearch. Again, 127.0.0.1. The default port for Elasticsearch is 9200, and because that is over port 1024, we can reuse that same port. We don't need to create new ones like we did with port 2222. Again, the IP address is 10.0.3.15. And the guest port is going to be port 9200 as well. Moving on, we're going to do Kibana. Again, 127.0.0.1. It uses a default port of 5601. And then we're going to use 10.0.3.15. And again, sending it to port 5601 on the guest. And finally, we're going to make a 4th one called Fleet. Again, 127.0.0.1. The default port for Fleet is 8220, and then again 10.0.3.15, and again over port 8220. So when you look, your port forwarding rules should look just exactly like mine to include all the IP addresses of 10.0.3.15. That'll be your default IP address for virtual machines that are being stood up. Select OK. Next, we need to create and then select OK again. Next, we need to create a DHCP range in order for our NAT or for our internal network to be able to pull an IP address. This is a little bit complicated, but it's something that has to be done for VirtualBox. First, you need to understand what is your IP range of your local network. So back on my host machine, I'm simply going to type, and I have several interfaces, but the interface that I'm interested in is EN0. It's my wireless interface. And my IP range is 192.168.1.174. So that means when I create a DHCP range, I cannot use 192.168. I'm going to use a 172 IP range. So the way that is done is through the VirtualBox Manager. From the command line, we'll type vbox manage DHCP server add network equals intnet. If you remember when we created the internal network, the network name was intnet. This is defining the server IP address of what is going to be what is going to be serving up DHCP. I'm saying 172.16.0.100, and then I'm giving the lower IP. This is the first IP address that the DHCP server will issue. In my case, 172.16.0.101. And then also setting the upper IP address. This is the last IP address that it will issue. And I'm setting that to 172.16.0.254. We won't use anywhere near that amount. However, this is part of the syntax. And then we need to enable that. I got an error message because I've already created this DHCP server. However, you would get a notice that you have created a DHCP server. That's all you need to do. That should all be up and running now. So when we start the VirtualBox up, everything should be able to access the internet properly. And we should also be able to access the system, and all the virtual machines will be able to communicate internally with each other. This is the last step in building the virtual machine. Next, we will be installing CentOS to install Elasticsearch. Now that we've created the virtual machine that we'll install the Elastic Stack on, let's go ahead and install the operating system, and then we can move on and install all the different elements of the Elastic Stack. So from inside the VirtualBox Manager, simply click on the Elastic Virtual Machine and click Start. Use your arrow keys to select Install CentOS Linux 8. Once the installer starts, we're going to select our language. From here, we need to select where we want to install the operating system. We added that 40 gigabyte hard disk, we'll select that. Next, kdump, the kernel dump. We don't need to enable that. We'll just go ahead and disable that. Next, let's get onto the network settings. We have two network interfaces. One is the int network, the internal network for the VMs to communicate, and the other is for it to connect to the internet and for us to be able to access it from access Kibana remotely. So we need to enable them both. Simply switch the toggle button from off to on for both. And they should both get IP addresses. We want to change our host name from localhost.localdomain to, in my example, packetpub.local. However, you can pick whatever you want. Click the apply button and then click done. The installation source will attempt to download all the package metadata so that it can understand what you want to install. This will take a second and we'll let it go ahead and do that. Next, let's go to time and date. everything should always be in UTC. So to do that, we select region of ETC, and then over under city, we select coordinated universal time. Click done. The installation source has identified the closest mirror on where it will download the packages from. In the software selection, we need to click, and all we need is the minimal installation. You can click minimal install, and then done. Okay, we have nothing else to do. Let's go ahead and begin the installation by clicking the installation button. Next, it's going to ask us to create a root password and a user. We do not need ever to set a root password. If we ever need to escalate privilege, we can do that as a user, but we don't need to set a root password. This will disable the root account by not setting a password, which is exactly what we want from a security perspective. You should never be in the habit of logging in as root. So click on user creation, and then select the name of the user account that you want to create. It doesn't really matter what it is. I'm selecting Packt Pub. That's the full name and the username. The important thing is to make this user an administrator. Next, define a password. When I'm using testing and things for not production, I always use simple passwords. And I do this so that I don't ever have to find myself fighting for some really convoluted and complex password that I may have made. I do something really simple. I always use the password of password. This is a demo, this is a test. I have no concern that this is ever going to have any production data in it. However, please follow any password standards that you use for your own environment, whether that be personally or in your organization. Click next. Because I'm using a bad password, it makes me click done twice. And the installation will go on and finish. Once the installation is complete, there will be a blue reboot button, and you can click that. Now that we've completed the installation of CentOS, we need to enable the internal network interface. By default, CentOS does not enable the internal network interface, but we can turn that on. So now that your machine is booted, you should be looking at a login screen. So we'll simply log in with the account that we created. And we're going to look at the IP interfaces to validate that one of them is not working properly. Using the command IPA, we can see that we have three interfaces. The loopback interface, which has an IP address of 127.0.0.1. Interface number 2, which says it's up but has no IP address, that's the internal network and we need to activate it. And then number 3, which is going to be our NAT IP address, which is 10.0.3.15. Your IP address should be the same, 10.0.3.15. So we need to activate interface 2 so that VMs can communicate between each other. So to do that, we'll use the Network Manager TUI, the text user interface. And we can start that simply by typing nmtui. Next, we'll go down to activate a connection. We can see here that ENP0S3, yours could be named different, doesn't have an asterisk next to it, and there's a menu option to activate it directly next to it. Using the arrow key, we can simply go over to activate. You'll notice that it now has an asterisk next to it. We can use tab to go down to the back button, and from back, we can hit quit. Now, we can type IPA, and we'll see that we have now 3 interfaces with 3 IP addresses. Interface 1 with the loopback has not changed. Interface 2 now has an IP address of 172.16.0.103. Yours could be different. This is just the IP range that I configured with the DHCP server command that we did a few steps ago. And again, 10.0.3.15 has not changed. Now we're ready to move on to further parts of the installation and configuration of this VM. Now that we've installed the operating system for the Elastic virtual machine, we're going to do a couple additional things to prepare it to install Elasticsearch on. So from the VirtualBox Manager, we'll go ahead and click the Start button. And from here we can see our login screen so we can log in with the user account that we created. My account, my instance, Packt pub, and then the password or whatever it is that you set. As you can see, we can log into the box. Everything is going really well from here. So we would like to be able to connect remotely over SSH. It makes copying and pasting easier if you're copying and pasting things out of a book or if you're copying and pasting things from the internet. You can't do that inside of the virtual machine. So what we can do is we can connect with Secure Shell, which we set up with the port forwarding earlier. So let's go ahead and log out and hop over to our machine, and we can remote into the virtual machine from here. So using Secure Shell, we'll define what port we want to use, and if we remember, we forwarded port 2222, and we need to define what user account we're going to log in with. As we just saw a second ago, the user account in my instance is Packt pub, but yours could be something different. And then we need to tell it what host we want to log into. If you remember, we forwarded port 2222 from 127.0.0.1 into the guest VM to port 22, which is the SSH port. This will connect to my local host 127.0.0.1 over port 2222, which will forward that into the guest of port 22, which is listening for default SSH. You can also use the word localhost here if you prefer, but we'll use 127. It's going to ask to verify that the authentication of the system that you're remoting into. We know where we're remoting, so we're going to go ahead and say yes. Now we're being asked for the password. And as we can see, I'm logged in as Packt pub to the elastic-packtpub.local machine that we created. So now that we've remoted into, what we want to do is we want to check for any updates that may need to be installed. I installed from the internet. However, if you use the DVD instead of pulling your packages from the internet live, you may have had them all onto an ISO. So it's good to do an update prior to moving forward. So we'll use the command to elevate our privileges to run commands, which is sudo superuser do. And then you can use either DNF or yum as a package updater. The new program is DNF, so we'll go ahead and use that, but yum still works. And it's going to ask for my password because I'm escalating my privileges. Like I said, I did everything live from the internet, so I don't have any things to install, but you could. Moving forward, we need to install the guest editions for the virtual machine. We need to install the EPEL release. So again, superuser do. And I'm going to add the -y command to the end of it. What this will do is this will, instead of asking me, once I tell it I want to install EPEL, it won't ask me, are you sure, and make me click Y for yes. I'm just going to tell it, look, I know what I want to install. I'm going to pass it the Y syntax. I want it to automatically say yes and do the installation. Because I had elevated to using superuser in the last 5 minutes, it did not re-ask me for my password again. However, it had been more than 5 minutes, it would ask me again for my password. So this installed EPEL release, which brings in some additional packages that we're going to need in order to install the guest editions. Next, we're going to install several packages that are needed, and then one that is not, but we'll talk about that when we get to it. Okay, the program that I am adding additionally is the program of Nano, N-A-N-O, here at the end. You can use, this is a text editor from the command line that we'll use when we're modifying some configuration files. Nano seems to be a little more approachable to people that are new to to editing text files with the command line. This is not a requirement. If you want to use VI or Vim or Emacs or anything else like that, feel free to. Just Nano is a little more approachable, so I thought I'd include that in there. Again, passing it the -y syntax. and it will go and download all of these packages, and then it will install them. Great, now we have everything installed. Finally, we need to set some environment variables, and that's done through a single command, through a single line. Now we're ready to install the guest add-ons. Back in the VirtualBox manager, we want to click on Elastic, click on Settings, click on the Storage button, and then click on the mounted ISO that we have. We want to remove that so that we can add the guest additions. If you click on the CD button, you can remove disk from virtual drive. Then click OK, and it will remove the disk from the virtual drive. And from here we can select, clicking the actual virtual machine, we can select Devices and Insert Guest Edition CD Image. This is simulating actually putting a CD into a CD tray and pushing it into the virtual machine. Next, we need to actually mount this. So back on at the command line, we're going to mount the CD that we just put in. It was put into the CD-ROM device, and we're going to mount it at media. We're going to change our directory into media. And then if we do a listing, we can see all the things that are in here. From here, we're going to run sudo vbox linux additions.run. If we're on a Windows machine, which we will be later, we will be running the VBox Windows guest editions. Finally, now that we have the guest editions installed, we can go ahead and do a reboot and prepare to install Elasticsearch.